Hello, my name is Midshipman Matthew Balsamo, second class, and this is my steering gear test video for ESEA340-Shipboard Systems 2 on the motor vessel Maersk, Tennessee. The first step in this process would be for the first assistant engineer to wait in the engine control room for a call down from the bridge, specifically from the mate on watch, stating that they are ready to conduct the steering gear test. Once the first assistant engineer has been notified by the mate on watch that the steering gear test is going to be conducted, the first engineer will head back aft into the steering gear room and make a call on the telephone from the steering gear room up to the bridge, relaying the message that they're ready for the steering gear test to start. The first assistant engineer will then stand by and wait for the test to proceed. The first assistant engineer will stand by the top end of the rudder stock, right pictured here, and continue to stand by until the bridge begins to conduct the steering gear test. How the steering gear mechanism works is the hydraulic rams control the orientation of the rudder by turning the rudder stock to certain degrees, and yeah. Pictured here is the rudder angle indicator, and the first engineer will watch the rudder angle indicator as the rudder sweeps from 35 degrees port to starboard and back. The first engineer will also keep note of how long it takes to make this movement, and this is important in the case of an emergency maneuvering. And overall, the first engineer is assessing the functionality of the steering gear mechanism. If the vessel is stationary, the rudder will be swept as previously mentioned. However, if the vessel is underway, swinging the rudder 15 degrees port to starboard is sufficient as not to deviate the vessel from its course. When conducting this test, check the area of the steering gear, look for oil pooling in the containments, which could indicate an oil leak, check the system pressures, and check that the motors are running normally, they sound correct, and are running efficiently. At the conclusion of this test, the rudder should return to 0 degrees on the rudder angle indicator, and the first assistant engineer will stand by the steering gear telephone for a call down from the bridge, specifically from the mate on watch. Once the first engineer receives a call down from the bridge indicating that the test is over via the mate on watch, the first engineer will read on the gyro compass located directly above the telephone the current position to let the mate on watch know so that they may match up the numbers to see if there's a problem and if it is correct. After the first engineer notifies the mate on watch over the phone that the gyro compass is correct, they will head down to the mid-level of the engine room. As previously stated, the first engineer will make their way to the mid-level of the engine room and head to the local maneuvering station pictured here, which is all the way forward on this level. Once the first engineer has reached this level, they will call up to the bridge, more specifically the mate on watch, to notify them that they have arrived and they are ready to conduct the next step of this process. For the next step of this process, I'm going to let a video play indicating the matching of the bells. In this video, the first assistant engineer is seen setting up the bell with the central dial to a certain speed. Then the bridge follows up immediately behind him. At the beginning of the video, after going from full astern to full ahead, the first assistant engineer will lead the dial towards the center direction, heading towards the stop. The mate on watch conducting the same test from the bridge will follow closely behind the actions of the first assistant engineer, ensuring that the local maneuvering station is working properly. The first assistant engineer will repeat the step shown in the video, except this time completely in the astern direction, heading back towards the stop dial. Once the actions on the local maneuvering station have been completed, the first assistant engineer will call up to the bridge from each of these telephones, one being sound powered and one being electric, to ensure that both of them work in the case of an emergency. Following this message being relayed to the bridge, the first assistant engineer will head back up to the engine control room. For the final portion of this steering gear test, the first assistant engineer, as previously stated, will make their way to the engine control room, where they will call back up to the bridge, indicating that they are ready to proceed with the engine order telegraph test. The man on watch will be conducting this test from the bridge, in which the first assistant engineer will follow closely behind using the dial shown in this photo. The man on watch will move the dial on the bridge to both the full ahead and full astern directions, hitting all other speeds in between, in which the first assistant engineer will reciprocate. Once the dial has been brought back to the neutral or stop direction at the center shown here in this photo, the man on watch will call down to the engine room to notify the first assistant engineer that this process is over. Following the conclusion of this test, the first assistant engineer will log in the logbook that the steering gear test has been completed. Lastly, the first assistant engineer will check off on the standby or departure checklist that the steering gear test has been completed, indicating the end of this process.